Pay attention to the pilot in uniform crouching by the trash bin. His name is Mazar. He just burned several Bibles in hatred. Then, sudden wind extinguishes flames, papers remain intact. Pilot drops to knees in shock.
My name is Mazar. I'm 34 years old, a commercial airline pilot for 12 years. On October 20th, 2021, I committed what I thought was a righteous act that would change my eternal destiny forever. That night, I burned Bibles at Atlanta Airport, believing I was defending Allah's honor. I need to take you back to understand who I was before that night changed everything. My story begins in Lahore, Pakistan, where I was born into a family that breathed Islam with every heartbeat. My father, Imam Rashid, led prayers at our neighborhood mosque, and our home was a sanctuary of Islamic devotion. The sound of the call to prayer wasn't just something we heard 5 times a day, it was the rhythm that governed our entire existence. From the moment I could speak, I was memorizing verses from the Quran. By age 12, I had committed nearly half of the holy book to memory. My father would beam with pride as I recited passages in perfect Arabic, my voice echoing through our modest home. The neighbors would often comment on how blessed our family was to have such a devout son. Islam wasn't just my religion, it was my identity, my purpose, my entire understanding of reality. Growing up, I was taught that Christians had corrupted the true message that Jesus brought. My father explained how the original Injil, the true gospel, had been twisted and changed by men seeking power. The Bible, he said, was a collection of lies and fabrications that led people away from the straight path of Islam. Jesus was indeed a great prophet, one of the most important messengers of Allah, but Christians had made the grave error of worshipping him as God. This teaching shaped my entire worldview. When I encountered Christians in Pakistan, I felt a mixture of pity and anger. Pity because they were sincere people following a corrupted message, and anger because their leaders had deceived them so thoroughly. I remember being particularly upset when Christian missionaries would visit our area, distributing their literature and trying to convert Muslims. It felt like an invasion, an attack on everything sacred. My hatred for Christianity deepened during my teenage years. I read Islamic apologetics that detailed every supposed contradiction in the Bible, every historical inconsistency, every theological error. I became skilled at debating Christians, able to quote verses that seemed to contradict their beliefs about Jesus being God. The Trinity made no sense to me. How could God be 3 persons yet one? It seemed like mathematical impossibility wrapped in theological confusion. When I turned 20, my dream of becoming a pilot began taking shape. Aviation had always fascinated me, and I saw it as a way to serve Allah while exploring His creation from the skies. My family supported this dream, seeing it as an honorable profession that could help me provide for a future family while maintaining my faith. In 2015, I moved to the United States to pursue advanced pilot training and eventually secured a position with a major commercial airline. The transition was challenging, but I was determined to remain faithful to my Islamic principles even in a predominantly Christian country. I found a mosque in Atlanta where I could pray when on layovers, and I made sure to maintain all my religious obligations despite the demanding flight schedules. Living in America actually intensified my opposition to Christianity. Everywhere I looked, I saw what I considered evidence of Christian moral decay. The materialism, the casual attitude toward family values, the way many Christians seem to ignore their own religious teachings. It confirmed everything I had been taught about Christianity being a corrupted religion that couldn't provide real spiritual guidance. The airports became particularly frustrating for me. I would regularly encounter Christian groups distributing literature, chaplains offering prayers, and passengers reading Bibles during flights. Each encounter reinforced my belief that I was surrounded by people following a false path. When passengers would try to engage me in religious conversations, I would politely but firmly redirect them. Some even invited me to their churches, which I found presumptuous and offensive. My fellow Muslim pilots and I would often discuss these encounters during our breaks. We shared a sense of being spiritual warriors, maintaining our faith in hostile territory. We saw ourselves as representatives of true monotheism, in a land confused by Trinitarian theology. The Christian crew members were generally respectful, but I always felt an underlying tension, knowing they believed I was heading for eternal damnation, while I knew they were the ones following a corrupted message. The Islamic community in Atlanta became my refuge. During layovers, I would visit the mosque, perform my prayers, and find comfort in the familiar rhythms of proper worship. The imam there often spoke about the importance of staying strong in our faith while living among non-believers. He reminded us that we were following the final message, the completion of what Jesus had actually taught before his words were twisted by Paul and later church leaders. Ask yourself this question. Have you ever been so certain about something that you would stake your eternal soul on it? That was me with Islam. I wasn't just culturally Muslim or nominally religious. I was a true believer who saw my faith as the only path to salvation. Christianity wasn't just wrong in my mind, it was dangerously wrong, leading millions of people away from the truth that could save them. My prayers were fervent and regular. 5 times a day, I would orient myself toward Mecca and submit to Allah with complete devotion. I fasted during Ramadan even when flying, which sometimes created scheduling challenges. I gave my zakat faithfully and planned to make the Hajj pilgrimage as soon as my career allowed. Every aspect of my life was ordered according to Islamic principles. The Quran was my constant companion. I carried a small copy in my flight bag and would read it during breaks. The beauty of the Arabic language, the depth of the teachings, the perfect guidance it provided for every situation, all of this reinforced my conviction that Islam was the final revelation from God. When I read verses about Jesus in the Quran, describing him as a great prophet who performed miracles, but was definitely not divine, I felt the peace that comes from having clear, uncorrupted truth. This was who I was on October 20th, 2021. A devout Muslim pilot who genuinely believed I was defending Allah's honor by opposing Christianity in all its forms. October 20th, 2021 started like any other layover in Atlanta. I had just completed a flight from Los Angeles, and my next departure wasn't until 6 a.m. the following morning. The late-night arrivals always meant quieter terminals, fewer crowds, and more time for personal reflection. I usually appreciated these peaceful moments between flights, using them for prayer and reading from the Quran. After completing the post-flight paperwork and securing the aircraft, I made my way to the crew lounge on the 3rd level of Terminal B. The fluorescent lights hummed softly overhead as my footsteps echoed through the nearly empty corridors. Most passengers had long since departed, leaving behind only the skeleton crew of maintenance workers and security personnel who keep airports running through the night hours. As I pushed open the door to the crew lounge, expecting to find the familiar quiet space where I could perform my evening prayers, something immediately caught my attention that made my blood pressure spike. There, scattered across the central table like some kind of deliberate provocation, was a stack of Bibles. Not just 1 or 2 copies, but at least 10 identical volumes with their distinctive black covers and gold lettering. A small handwritten note was attached to the top Bible that read, "Free gift from Atlanta Christian Pilots Fellowship. May God bless your travels." The sight hit me like a physical blow. Here was a space that I considered neutral territory, a place where Muslim crew members like myself came to pray and find peace, and it had been invaded by Christian propaganda. My hands started trembling slightly as I picked up the note. The casual presumption of these Christian pilots infuriated me. They had taken it upon themselves to evangelize in a space used by people of all faiths. Did they think we were so spiritually lost that we needed their corrupted scriptures thrust upon us? Did they believe their false gospel was so compelling that simply leaving their books around would convert us? I looked around the empty lounge, my anger building with each passing second. The quiet hum of the air conditioning seemed to amplify the tension I felt coursing through my body. These weren't just books to me. They were symbols of everything I had been taught to oppose. Each Bible represented centuries of theological error, countless souls led astray from the true path of Islam. Think about a moment when someone violated something you considered sacred. That surge of protective anger, that feeling that something precious was being attacked. That's exactly what I experienced standing in that crew lounge. These Christian pilots had brought their false teachings into our shared space, assuming we would welcome their misguided attempts at salvation. I picked up one of the Bibles and flipped through its pages. Seeing the familiar verses that I had learned to refute during my years of Islamic education. John 3:16, Romans 10:9, all the passages that Christians use to support their claim that Jesus was divine rather than simply a prophet. The very act of holding these books felt like contamination, like I was touching something spiritually dangerous. The more I thought about it, the angrier I became. How many Muslim crew members would see these books and feel uncomfortable? How many might even be tempted to read them out of curiosity? These Christian pilots were essentially setting spiritual traps, using our shared professional space to spread what I knew to be theological poison. I began gathering the Bibles, stacking them carefully as my mind raced with indignation. The weight of them in my arms felt heavy, not just physically but spiritually. Here I was, holding nearly a dozen copies of what I had been taught was corrupted scripture, books that had led millions away from the true worship of Allah. Standing there with those Bibles in my hands, I made a decision that felt absolutely righteous in that moment. I would not let these books remain here to confuse or mislead other Muslims. I would not allow this Christian invasion of our neutral space to go unchallenged. Allah had placed me here at this exact moment for a reason, and that reason was to defend the purity of true monotheistic worship. The crew lounge felt too public for what I had decided to do. Even though it was nearly empty at this hour, there were still security cameras and the possibility of someone walking in at any moment. I needed a more private location where I could properly dispose of these theological corruptions without interference. I remembered the maintenance area on the lower level, a space I had visited before during aircraft inspections. It was isolated, rarely monitored, and had the industrial trash bins that would be perfect for what I planned to do. Gathering all the Bibles in my arms, I left the crew lounge and made my way through the quiet terminal corridors. The maintenance area was exactly as I remembered, dimly lit by overhead fluorescent lights, filled with the mechanical sounds of airport infrastructure, and completely deserted at this hour. Large metal trash bins stood against the walls, and the concrete floors echoed with each step I took. I approached one of the larger bins and carefully placed the stack of Bibles inside. As I arranged them, I felt a sense of religious duty filling my chest. This was not an act of vandalism or hatred. This was spiritual warfare. I was protecting other Muslims from exposure to corrupted teachings. I was defending Allah's truth against the lies that had deceived so many. Reaching into my pocket, I pulled out my lighter, the same one I used for the occasional cigarette during particularly stressful flights. My hands were steady now, no longer trembling with anger, but filled with righteous purpose. I genuinely believed that Allah would be pleased with what I was about to do. As I held the lighter above those Bibles, I felt completely justified in my actions. I was a faithful Muslim, defending his faith against theological corruption. I was removing spiritual pollution from a space where believers came to worship. I was doing exactly what any devout follower of Islam should do when confronted with such blatant attempts at false evangelism. I flicked the lighter and watched the small flame dance in the dim light of the maintenance area, ready to complete what I saw as an act of religious devotion. The small flame from my lighter flickered in the dim maintenance area as I lowered it toward the stack of Bibles. My heart was beating with what I believed was righteous purpose. Every fiber of my being felt aligned with what I saw as Allah's will. This was my moment to defend the purity of Islamic teaching against the corruption of Christian theology. I touched the flame to the corner of the top Bible, and it caught immediately. The dry pages began to curl and blacken as the fire spread across the cover. I stepped back slightly, watching with satisfaction as the flames began consuming what I considered to be spiritual poison. The smell of burning paper filled the enclosed space, and I felt a deep sense of accomplishment. As the fire grew stronger, consuming more of the books, I stood with my arms crossed, watching my act of religious devotion unfold. The orange glow illuminated my face in the dim maintenance area, and I felt completely at peace with what I was doing. In my mind, I was serving Allah, protecting other Muslims from theological deception and striking a blow against the false teachings that had led so many people astray. The flames danced higher now, and I could see individual pages curling and disappearing into ash. Each page that burned felt like a victory for true monotheism over the confused Trinitarian theology of Christianity. I thought about how pleased my father would be if he knew what I was doing. I imagined the approval of the Imam back home in Pakistan, how he would commend me for taking such decisive action against spiritual corruption. Standing there in that maintenance area, I felt like a spiritual warrior completing a sacred mission. The industrial sounds of the airport's infrastructure hummed around me, but my focus was entirely on the flames consuming those false scriptures. I had read enough Islamic apologetics to know exactly why these books deserved to burn. They taught that Jesus was God, which was the ultimate blasphemy against Allah's perfect unity. They promoted the absurd doctrine of the Trinity, which made no logical or theological sense. The fire was really going now, and I allowed myself to feel proud of what I had accomplished. No Muslim crew member would be confused by these corrupted teachings. No sincere seeker of truth would be led astray by the theological errors contained in these pages. I had done what any faithful Muslim should do when confronted with such blatant spiritual deception. I thought about the Christian pilots who had left these books, imagining their disappointment when they discovered their evangelistic materials had been properly disposed of. They probably believed they were performing some kind of Christian service by spreading their false gospel. But I had intervened to protect people from their misguided efforts. In my mind, I was the hero of this story, the faithful Muslim who refused to let falsehood go unchallenged. The satisfaction I felt was complete and overwhelming. Every moment of my Islamic education had prepared me for this. Every sermon I had heard about defending the faith, every verse I had memorized about standing firm against corruption, every teaching about the importance of maintaining pure monotheism, all of it had led to this moment of decisive action. As I watched the flames consume more of the books, I began mentally composing the story I would tell my Muslim friends, how I had discovered this Christian invasion of our neutral space, how I had taken immediate action to protect other believers, how I had stood firm in defense of Allah's truth against the forces of theological deception. They would understand and appreciate what I had done. The fire had now consumed most of the visible text on the covers, and the pages were turning to ash and floating in the air currents of the maintenance area. I felt a deep spiritual satisfaction watching this destruction of false teaching. Every page that burned represented another lie being eliminated, another source of confusion being removed from the world. You need to understand how completely righteous I felt in that moment. There was no doubt in my mind that I was doing exactly what Allah wanted me to do. My Islamic training had taught me that Christians had corrupted the original message that Jesus brought, and here I was, literally burning the evidence of that corruption. It felt like the most natural and spiritually appropriate response possible. The flames continued their work, and I stood guard over them like a sentinel protecting something sacred. The concrete floor beneath the metal bin grew warm, and the smell of burning paper intensified. I was completely absorbed in watching this act of spiritual purification unfold before my eyes. I thought about Jesus himself, the real Jesus described in the Quran, not the false version promoted by Christianity. The real Jesus would approve of what I was doing. He would want his true teachings protected from the corruptions that had been added by Paul and the early church fathers. I was defending his genuine legacy against the theological distortions that had grown up around his name. The sense of accomplishment I felt was almost overwhelming. I had not just passively encountered false teaching and walked away. I had taken active measures to eliminate it. I had struck a blow for truth against falsehood, for clarity against confusion, for pure monotheism against Trinitarian error. As more pages turned to ash, I reflected on how this moment represented everything I believed about the difference between Islam and Christianity. Islam was clear, logical, and pure. Christianity was confused, contradictory, and corrupted. These burning books were physical evidence of why Islam was the final and perfect revelation from Allah. The fire was burning steadily now, consuming the last recognizable remnants of text and binding. I stood there feeling completely victorious, completely justified, and completely certain that I had done the right thing. The maintenance area felt like a sacred space where truth had triumphed over falsehood. In my mind, this was the perfect end to a perfect act of religious devotion. I had discovered a spiritual threat and eliminated it completely. I had defended my faith and protected other Muslims from deception. I had served Allah with courage and conviction. I could not have imagined that in the next few seconds, everything I believed about reality was about to change forever. I was standing there, arms crossed, feeling completely satisfied with what I had accomplished when something impossible happened. Without any warning, a powerful wind suddenly filled the maintenance area. I'm talking about a wind so strong it nearly knocked me off my feet, and this was happening inside a concrete building with no open doors or windows. The wind hit the flames with such force that they were instantly extinguished. Not gradually dampened or slowly smothered, but completely eliminated in a single moment. The papers that had been burning, curling, and turning to ash suddenly scattered through the air. But as they settled back down into the metal bin, I could see they were completely intact. No burn marks, no charred edges, no evidence that fire had ever touched them. My first instinct was complete denial. This couldn't be happening. Burnt paper doesn't just become new again. That's not how physics works. That's not how reality operates. I rubbed my eyes hard, thinking I was experiencing some kind of optical illusion brought on by fatigue or stress from the long flight. But when I opened my eyes, the scene remained unchanged. The Bibles sat in the bin, looking exactly as they had when I first placed them there. The covers were pristine black leather with gold lettering. The pages were crisp white, without a single scorch mark. Even the smell of burning paper had completely disappeared from the air. My hands began trembling uncontrollably. I reached toward the bin with shaking fingers and picked up the top Bible, the same one I had seen catch fire and begin to burn. The cover was cool to the touch, not warm as it should have been if it had just been burning. I flipped through the pages, searching for any evidence of fire damage, but found nothing. The text was clear and unblemished. The paper felt fresh and new. The temperature in the maintenance area had dropped noticeably. I could feel goosebumps rising on my arms despite wearing my pilot's uniform jacket. The concrete walls seemed to radiate a coldness that hadn't been there moments before. My breath was beginning to form small clouds in the suddenly frigid air, but the most unsettling sensation was the overwhelming feeling that I was being watched. Not by security cameras or airport personnel, but by something far more significant and powerful. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and every instinct in my body was screaming that I was in the presence of something beyond my understanding. Ask yourself this question. When was the last time you witnessed something that completely violated everything you thought you knew about how the world works? That's exactly what I was experiencing. My entire framework for understanding reality was crumbling in real time. I stumbled backward from the bin, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it echoing in my ears. The rational part of my mind was desperately trying to find an explanation. Maybe there had been a malfunction in the airport's ventilation system. Maybe the sprinkler system had activated without my noticing. Maybe I was having some kind of medical episode brought on by stress. But deep down, in a place I didn't want to acknowledge, I knew I was witnessing something supernatural. Something that operated outside the natural laws I had always relied upon. Something that suggested there were forces at work in the universe far beyond my Islamic understanding of how Allah operated in the world. I picked up another Bible from the bin, then another, examining each one with growing panic. They were all perfectly restored. Every single book that I had watched burn was now in pristine condition. The evidence of my righteous act of faith defense had been completely erased by forces I couldn't comprehend. My legs felt weak, and I had to lean against the concrete wall for support. Everything I had believed about reality was being challenged by what I was seeing. In Islamic theology, Allah could certainly perform miracles, but this didn't feel like the work of Allah. This felt like something else entirely, something that was specifically opposing what I had tried to do. The thought began creeping into my mind that I had just witnessed Jesus demonstrating his power, Not the Jesus of Islamic teaching who was merely a prophet, but the Jesus that Christians claimed was divine. The Jesus who supposedly had power over the natural world, who could make the impossible become possible. I tried to push that thought away, but it kept returning with increasing force. What if everything I had been taught about Jesus being just a prophet was wrong? What if the Christians were right about his divine nature? What if I had just tried to destroy the word of someone who actually had the power to restore burned books instantly? My breathing became rapid and shallow. I was hyperventilating as the full implications of what I might have just witnessed began to sink in. If Jesus really was God, then I had just committed an act of incredible blasphemy. I hadn't been defending Allah's truth. I had been attacking the word of the true God. The maintenance area seemed to spin around me as I struggled to process what was happening. My Islamic worldview, which had been the foundation of my entire existence for 34 years, was collapsing under the weight of this impossible event. Everything I thought I knew about God, about Jesus, about the nature of divine truth, was being turned upside down. I fell to my knees, not in Islamic prayer, but in complete bewilderment and terror. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely control them. The concrete floor felt cold against my knees, but I barely noticed the physical discomfort through my emotional and spiritual chaos. The restored Bibles sat in that metal bin like silent witnesses to power I had never imagined possible. Each pristine page represented evidence that everything I had believed might be fundamentally wrong. The Christian scriptures I had tried to destroy had been supernaturally preserved by forces beyond my comprehension. In that moment, kneeling on the cold concrete floor of an Atlanta airport maintenance area surrounded by perfectly restored Bibles and the lingering presence of something divine, I whispered the first words I had ever spoken directly to Jesus. What is happening to me? Kneeling on that cold concrete floor, I was completely overwhelmed by what I had just witnessed. My entire understanding of reality had been shattered in the span of a few seconds. The restored Bible sat in the metal bin like physical evidence that everything I thought I knew about God was wrong. My hands were still trembling as I reached up and pulled one of the books toward me. The Bible fell open to a page that I had never read before, and my eyes immediately focused on a verse that seemed to jump off the page. I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. It was John 14:6. And for the first time in my life, I was reading the words of Jesus not as the corrupted teachings of a false religion, but as the potential words of God himself. As I read those words, something extraordinary began happening inside my heart. The anger and righteousness I had felt just minutes before were being replaced by an overwhelming sense of conviction. Not the kind of religious conviction I was familiar with from Islam, but a deep, personal awareness that I had been fighting against truth instead of defending it. The presence I had felt watching me became even stronger, and I realized with growing certainty that Jesus was there with me in that maintenance area, not just as a prophet or a historical figure, but as the living God who had just demonstrated his power by restoring the books I had tried to destroy. The same Jesus who claimed to be the way, the truth, and the life was revealing himself to a Muslim pilot who had just burned Bibles in hatred. My Islamic training told me this was impossible. Allah was one, indivisible, without partners or associates. The Trinity was logical nonsense, and Jesus was just another prophet in a long line of messengers. But my training hadn't prepared me for witnessing supernatural intervention that specifically protected Christian scriptures from my attempts to destroy them. I continued reading from the open Bible, and every verse seemed to speak directly to my situation. But God demonstrates his own love for us in this. While we were still sinners, Christ died for us. Romans 5:8 hit me like a physical blow because I realized I was exactly what it described, a sinner who had been actively opposing Jesus while he was simultaneously demonstrating his love for me. The tears began flowing before I even realized I was crying. 34 years of Islamic certainty was crumbling as I knelt there, with the evidence of Jesus' divine power surrounding me. I had tried to burn his word, and he had responded not with judgment or punishment, but with a miracle that revealed his truth. This wasn't the Allah I had worshipped, who demanded perfect submission and threatened severe punishment for disobedience. Think about the most certain belief you've ever held, something you would have staked your life on without hesitation. Now imagine discovering in a single moment that everything you believed was completely wrong. That's exactly what I was experiencing as I knelt there with that open Bible in my hands. The weight of my actions began pressing down on me with crushing force. I hadn't just burned some books. I had attacked the word of the God who had created me, who had sustained my life, who had given me the career I loved and the blessings I enjoyed. I had been so proud of my religious devotion when I was actually rebelling against the very source of all goodness and truth. But even more overwhelming than the conviction was the love I felt surrounding me. Despite what I had just done, despite years of opposing Christianity and mocking the idea that Jesus was divine, I felt completely enveloped by an unconditional love that I had never experienced before. It wasn't the conditional love of Allah that depended on my performance and obedience. It was the perfect love of a God who loved me, even while I was his enemy. I looked up from the Bible toward the ceiling of the maintenance area, and through my tears I whispered words I never thought I would say. Jesus, if you are truly God, if you are truly the way to salvation, I surrender my life to you completely. The moment those words left my mouth, I felt a transformation unlike anything I had ever experienced. The fear and panic that had consumed me were replaced by an indescribable peace. The spiritual burden I had carried my entire life, the constant striving to please Allah through perfect religious performance, was suddenly lifted from my shoulders. I understood for the first time that salvation wasn't something I had to earn through prayers, fasting, pilgrimage, and good works. It was a gift that Jesus offered freely to anyone who would accept it, even to someone like me who had just tried to destroy his word. The Jesus I had been taught was merely a prophet, was revealing himself as the Savior who died for my sins and rose again to give me eternal life. The implications of this revelation were staggering. Everything I had built my life upon was false. My family, my friends, my community, they were all following a religion that led away from rather than toward the true God. The Quran I had memorized, the prayers I had faithfully recited, the Islamic theology I had mastered, all of it was leading me away from the very God I thought I was serving. But even as I realized the magnitude of what this conversion would cost me, I felt nothing but gratitude. Jesus had revealed himself to me in the most dramatic way possible, using my own attempt to attack him as the vehicle for my salvation. He could have left me in my spiritual darkness, but instead he chose to demonstrate his power and love in a way I couldn't possibly ignore or rationalize away. I spent the next hour on my knees in that maintenance area, reading through the Bible that had opened to John 14:6. Every page seemed to contain truths that my heart had been searching for without even knowing it. The character of Jesus revealed in those pages was nothing like what I had been taught in Islamic theology. He was gentle, loving, merciful, and infinitely powerful. When I finally stood up from that concrete floor, I was a completely different person than the one who had knelt down. I was no longer Mazhar the devout Muslim pilot. I was Mazhar the new follower of Jesus Christ. The cost of my conversion became clear almost immediately. When I called my father 3 days later to tell him what had happened, the silence on the other end of the phone lasted so long I thought the connection had been lost. When he finally spoke, his voice was broken with grief and anger. "You are no longer my son," he said before hanging up. Those words cut deeper than any physical wound could have. My mother refused to speak to me at all. My siblings sent messages through relatives telling me I was dead to the family unless I returned to Islam. The mosque community in Atlanta that had been my spiritual home during layovers turned cold and hostile when word spread about my conversion. Brothers who had embraced me just days before now crossed the street to avoid me. The professional consequences were swift and sometimes severe. Several of my Muslim colleagues requested schedule changes to avoid flying with me. On certain international routes, particularly to Muslim-majority countries, I faced open hostility from crew members who saw me as a traitor to Islam. Some passengers, when they learned of my conversion, demanded to be reassigned to different flights. But even as I lost relationships that had defined my entire adult life, I was gaining something far more valuable: The peace I felt after surrendering my life to Jesus was unlike anything I had experienced during 34 years of Islamic devotion. Instead of the constant anxiety about whether my prayers were acceptable to Allah, whether my good deeds outweighed my sins, whether I would pass the test on Judgment Day, I had complete assurance of my salvation through Jesus Christ. The Bible became my constant companion during flights. The same flight bag that used to carry my Quran now held the restored Bible from that miraculous night. Every break between flights became an opportunity to dive deeper into the scriptures that I had once tried to destroy. The words that had seemed like theological corruption just weeks before now revealed themselves as the most beautiful and life-giving truths I had ever encountered. Pastor Williams, whose phone number I found written inside the cover of one of the restored Bibles, became my spiritual mentor and the brother I never knew I needed. When I called him that first morning after my conversion, stammering through my story of burning Bibles and witnessing their miraculous restoration, he listened without judgment and invited me to his church immediately. The congregation at New Hope Baptist Church welcomed me with an acceptance that contrasted sharply with the rejection I faced elsewhere. These Christians didn't see me as a former enemy who had converted. They saw me as a brother who had come home. They understood that my conversion came with tremendous personal cost, and they surrounded me with prayer and practical support during the hardest transition of my life. Captain Rodriguez, a Christian pilot I had worked with several times before my conversion, became an unexpected source of strength. He had always been respectful of my Islamic faith and never pushed Christianity on me during our flights together. When he learned about my conversion and the challenges I was facing, he requested to be paired with me on as many flights as possible, providing a shield of support during a very vulnerable time. The financial impact was significant as well. My family in Pakistan had been receiving regular support from my airline salary, money that helped pay for my younger sister's education and my father's medical expenses. When I became a Christian, I lost not just my family's love, but also the ability to support them financially, as they refused to accept money from someone they now considered an apostate. Yet even in the midst of these losses, I experienced joy that I had never known during my years as a devout Muslim. Sunday worship services became the highlight of my week, times when I could freely express my love for Jesus without fear of persecution or judgment. The hymns that the congregation sang often moved me to tears as I reflected on how Jesus had pursued me even when I was his enemy. 3 years have passed since that miraculous night in the Atlanta airport maintenance area, and I can tell you with absolute certainty that Jesus Christ is not just a prophet sent by God. He is God incarnate, the second person of the Trinity, the Savior who died for the sins of the world and rose again to defeat death itself. My life now has a purpose that goes far beyond flying commercial aircraft from city to city. I've begun sharing my testimony at churches throughout the country, telling the story of how Jesus revealed himself to a Muslim who tried to burn Bibles. Every time I speak, I see faces in the audience that remind me of who I used to be. People who are certain they have found the truth but haven't yet encountered the real Jesus. I've also started a ministry for Muslim converts to Christianity, understanding firsthand the unique challenges they face when leaving Islam for Christ. The rejection from family, the loss of community, the professional difficulties. All of these are prices that many Muslims are willing to pay once they encounter the real Jesus, but they need support during the transition. Look inside your own heart right now and ask yourself this question. What would it take for you to abandon everything you've built your life upon? What kind of evidence would convince you that your most fundamental beliefs were wrong? For me, it took witnessing an impossible miracle performed by the very person I had been taught was just another prophet. The restored Bibles from that night sit on my bookshelf at home, physical reminders of Jesus' power and grace. Sometimes I pick them up and run my fingers over the pages that I watched burn and then saw supernaturally restored. They serve as tangible proof that the Jesus I now follow is not bound by the laws of physics or the limitations of human understanding. If Jesus could reveal himself to a Muslim pilot who burned Bibles in an airport maintenance area, he can reveal himself to anyone. Don't wait for a dramatic supernatural intervention like I received. Jesus is calling you today through his word, through his people, through the gentle prompting of his spirit in your heart. The same Jesus who restored those burned pages wants to restore your broken life, your fractured relationships, your wounded heart. He's not looking for perfect people to follow him. He's looking for people who recognize their need for salvation and are willing to surrender their lives to the only one who can truly save them.